Anita.
Good morning. My name is Cassidy Johnson. I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Anna Bhatta. Dr. Bhatta is an associate professor in the Department of International Security Studies at the Air War College. Her teaching and research interests include Russian politics and foreign policy, Eastern European politics, and the politics of authoritarian states. Her book, The Russian Minorities in the Former Soviet Republics, Succession, Integration, and Homeland, was published in 2022. Dr. Bhatta holds a PhD in political science and conflict studies from the University of North Texas. She grew up in Hungary during the Cold War. Please help me welcome Dr. Anna Bhatta.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome and the introduction. The first disclaimer I would like to do is that the best war college is not the Naval War College, but the Air War College. But you know this year we are here in mine. So first of all, it is a privilege and a rare opportunity to speak here in mine today. I had the chance and the privilege to teach some of the bright minds of this community right over here as well. So let me go ahead and move. Let's see. Here we go. So you hear a lot about the war in Ukraine. You hear in the news. You read magazines. You read analysis. My focus here will be to talk about how Russia thinks. I grew up in communist Hungary and left when I was 22, so it was 1991 when the system just collapsed and we changed. It was a huge change, and I happened to come here for 1 year, and then my husband said we'll check out the Grand Canyon and we'll go back to Spain or France, but that never happened. So we stayed. So my speech will be about how Russia thinks. I'll give you 3 schools of thought, try to place Russia in a context, and what are the implications for the US today. So it's going to be a little bit like the Eras tour in some ways. Before I begin, I wanted to let you know that all these 3 various poles, the statist, the westernizers, and the civilizationist, I believe that Russia today is a statist civilizationist. However, it wasn't always so. For a long time, after 1990, after the Soviet collapse, the Russian Federation did try to become a liberal democratic country. They tried to incorporate into our system, which was very, very foreign for them. A system that they thought that they could make their own and add their own Russian characteristics to it. However, this did not happen. It was impossible, and a few years later, gradually, what we see today is a Russian Federation that is now a statist and civilizationist. That is an authoritarian system. That is, at the end, my assessment is that it's borderline Stalinist. It is resembling some of the previous historical periods of broad authoritarianism, but also repression. A system that was very much virulent at the time when I grew up in Hungary. So because it did not work of creating the European security architecture with Russia on board, Russia turned elsewhere and became a different type of country. So Another disclaimer is my required readings will be on my slides. I have a lot of slides. If you want, you can just listen, and you don't have to read everything on the slides. This is for your information. So
Ooh, I want to read it.
A little bit about statism, right? So what is this statist view? Because I think that is a constant way of how the Russian Federation has always worked, how the elite as well as the society has operated through time, really since from a very long time, back to the Tsar's era. It's sort of an ideology where the state is a very strong entity. It's a strong state that is imperative to function for the Russian society. It has the power to preserve the order, and it is indeed the duty of the Russian state to have the order, to create the order in society. And this underlies their domestic and also foreign policy decision making. And in fact, they are okay with the fact if this comes at the price of freedom and democracy. Yesterday, I spoke with one of the North Dakota senators at the reception, and she said, "I don't understand how anybody could give up this freedom, to give up our democratic system." However, I told her that actually, for the Russians, this has always been their mode of operation. They flirted with the idea of becoming democratic and being liberal-minded, but because it didn't work, and they had this complex that they are no longer a great power, they have done away with that world. So the individual and society must be subordinate to the state. You probably hear things of that sort of Papa Putin, right? Papa Putin will take care of us. And indeed he did for quite some time. And we have seen how he's taking care of society today. In order to demonstrate that Russia is a statist country where a strong state is crucial, I will let you read this quote from the Millennium message that Putin put forward to the people. So this quote shows you that indeed it's not something, a strong state is not something to be afraid of, not something to fight about, but it's something to embrace in the Russian mindset. For us, especially if someone is from a libertarian viewpoint, this is unfathomable. But the Russian state has always functioned as such. And I'll take you back on memory lane all the way to Leninism, communism, and socialism. This was perhaps the most representative time period in Russian history where a Soviet-style socialism meant that actually the state oversaw not only the people working within the workplace, but the state also had a very far and heavy reach into civil society as well. To give you one example, the Romanian stamp collectors had someone from the state, from the party, to oversee what they were doing. So it was a very far-reaching aspect of state power. Now, communism as such never happened anywhere around the world, where the ownership of the means of productions would be completely abolished. That didn't take place. However, this was the goal. This was what the communist system, the socialist system initially, what they wanted. This was the end game that the Soviets intended to do. On this slide, you see how, apart from how the pioneers are dressed today, And you also see that the system of state socialism had a very deep reach into society, in both work and life matters. However, the ultimate end goal was to accomplish a economic equality. My friend Ginta, who's from Lithuania, she's my conference buddy, and she tells me that she often gets questions from her students as to what did this mean? What did this whole socialist idea mean? This economic equality. In the United States, if you ask people, it means equal opportunity. No matter where you're from, no matter what your background is, if you work hard and if you're willing to put in the hours, you can accomplish anything you want. But in the Soviet Union and also in Hungary, Lithuania, in the Eastern Bloc, this meant everybody gets 2 eggs. Everybody gets equal economic objects. Now we all knew that this was not true. When the system came down in 1990, the Berlin Wall collapsed. We knew that a lot of the problems were hidden under the rug, and the people did not know the tremendous shape the economy was in Russia and also in other socialist countries. So the implications for the statist approach and the implications for communism and socialism today are really that the Russian state is very much familiar with a strong state, with repression, and the legacy is this continuation of oppression in society. They're fine with that system. But I do want to mention a little bit about the outfit of the pioneers here, because we were much more modest when we were pioneers. We did not wear the hat, and the outfit was completely different. But it seems there is a resurgence in Russia, and young pioneers are in once again in the country. The second school I would like to talk about a little bit is the so-called Westernizers. The Westernizers are those who believed that the Western system, our system, the European system, the US system, is indeed the most progressive civilization. They thought that the way Russia could become more higher level of civilization was if they adapted and took on some of the elements and aspects of the Western civilization. Peter the Great, you see here on the left, he ruled from the saddle, and he argued that actually taking on Western military technology can help him grow the empire, add on more territories. And he did indeed. At that time, Russia tripled in terms of adding its territory. And Catherine the Great, born in Germany, Saxony-Anhalt, took Western ideology of the Enlightenment to Russia. The philosophy of France. She frequently corresponded with D'Alembert and Rousseau and Voltaire from France. So these are the early Westernizers. Later on in the 1990s, as I mentioned, the Russian Federation is once again interested in taking on some of the characters and grow by that. Gorbachev, Yeltsin, Kozyryev, all thought that they will be part of the shapers of the European security architecture that after 1991 the European continent was created. They embarked on developing liberal democratic institutions, building a market economy. And their expectation was to join with the West, eventually. Now, it did not mean that Gorbachev wanted the Soviet Union to be gone. He preferred the Soviet Union as one entity. However, after the Crimea takeover of Russia in 2014, he agreed with that step of the Russian political elite. So the third school of thought that I would like to present to you is a so-called civilizationist school. And I believe that today, in addition to the constant, strong state school, it is this school, indeed, that is the most prevalent in Russia today. But it was not always so. Taylor Swift is not the only person who has champagne problems. There are other folks around the world who are famous, and we're familiar with them.
Infamous.
The civilizationist approach school of thought argues that these universal values that we would like to see around the world, that we think are our universal values, are not so universal. The Russian way of life, the Russian values are so distinct from the Western way of life that they think that the West indeed is posing an existential threat to Russia. Now, in our national security strategy, Russia is being portrayed as an existential threat, as an acute threat to us. And for the civilizations in Russia, it is the West that is the civilizational threat to their way of life, to their values. And they embrace the values of the Russian Orthodox Church as opposed to the Enlightenment. That's much more the Western philosophical strand that we follow. President Putin's advisors, such as Karganov and Dugin, all belong to the civilizationist camp. And this is going to get technical.
Whoa, this is moving quick.
The origins of this camp, this school of thought, actually go back all the way to the 1840s, which is the time period in European history when most European countries experienced a lot of upheaval, a lot of revolutionary movement, where nationalism as such is created and flourishes. So the so-called Slavophiles are the early civilizations of Russia. And the debate between the Westernizers and the Slavophiles is already occurring during that time. The Slavophiles argue that, well, actually, Russia is morally superior to the West. But the Westernizers think that, no, the Tsar state is backward, and it's the only way Russia will become much more advanced is if it is indeed able to take on some of Western values. And some of you might be familiar with Dostoevsky. The Brother Karamazov is something that I highly recommend you read. And I guess I in addition to my slides, I have other readings as well and other books for you to add to your long list. The Brother Karamazov gives you a sort of a snapshot of Russian society itself. We have the three brothers who are the typical people in Russian society. But I'm not going to give away the entire story, so you read that. So Dr. Dostoevsky, in the 1840s, he came up with the so-called Russian idea. We see something very similar happening today. There are folks in the academic community who argue that the West is declining, even the United States, that we are declining. And Dostoevsky argued that at the time it will be Russia to take its place. But in addition to that, Dostoevsky argued that actually the project that the West began can be finished, and Russia will finish that. Moving on, what are some of the examples of the civilization that's at work? What are some of the examples as to how they create policy, how they create international policy, but also domestic policy? And that is, of course, nationalism. The type of nationalism that Russia follows is protective nationalism. I mentioned Papa Putin will take care of the people. And the way they do this is by supporting compatriots in their year abroad. Compatriots are Russian speakers, Russian ethnicities in Ukraine, in Moldova, in Georgia, all over on the fringes of the Soviet Union. Essentially countries that seceded from the Soviet Union after the wall fell down, after the Soviet Union imploded. It's essentially, I told you that we can't look at it as all of a sudden the Eurasianist view became prevalent. It was progression from the time when President Putin was elected in 2000. Since then, they have started to think much more in nationalistic, much more in imperialistic ways. And they became much more radical, indeed in a sense that it's resembling a Stalinist dictatorship. The Russian speakers are folks, there are about 24 million Russians who got stranded behind the borders of the Soviet Union after the collapse. There are many different ways that Russia is reaching out to them. Obviously, one of the most prevalent forms is Russian information warfare through the Russian media. And of course, information is a hard word. It's much more disinformation and propaganda, Russian propaganda. Something that the word, the vocabulary we haven't used in such a long time. It was indeed something from the playbook of the Soviet times, propaganda. But now we get a lot of renaissance of some of the things that were occurring in the Soviet Union. Let me talk a little bit about imperialism. Jeffrey Markov's new book on empires of Eurasia hits the nail on its head. For a long time, I will admit that I didn't believe this. I didn't buy this argument that Russia is imperialist. I was still in the mindset that there are plenty of westernizers, there are plenty of those who would like to see a stable Europe, a European continent that still talks with the Russian Federation. But I think that over time, I am starting to believe much more that the imperialist roots that the Russians have actually is not going away. Just because we have a modern international system, which is made up of nation states, with following the international rules-based order, it doesn't mean that Russia is actually going to do that. Jeffrey's book designates other powers, among them China, as an additional country that still thinks in imperialist terms. And I think that's where we see some of the arguments about threat. That's where we see so much about the Chinese and the Russian threat today. They feel that they have retained the right to remain great powers. And I think that because the Russian Federation feels that they've taken away this great powerness from them, that is a problem. That is problematic in their mindset. Um, I talked a little bit about the Russian minorities, the ethnic Russians, Russian speakers. They are very similar. Essentially, in Ukraine, we have the largest number of Russian speakers, 11 million of them. But there are also folks in Kazakhstan, especially Estonia, Latvia. You might hear about this. At the time when the Soviet system collapsed, folks such as Solzhenitsyn, he's another writer, took on to speak about taking care of the Russian speakers. It is the Russians' duty to take care of them. But really the idea is that there's this strong state that is not only prevalent within the country, but also beyond the borders. We see a strong state that is functioning even beyond the borders of Russia. So just to sum this up, this section of the talk, the status quo is dominant. A strong state is prevalent in Russian circles, in elite circles, but also at the grassroots, at the societal level. And we have seen over time this debate between the statists and the westernizers. And in the 1990s, it was the westernizers school that was dominant. However, since about 2012, it's becoming much more prevalent that the civilization state was more important. And ultimately, the debate was won by the civilizationists. Why is that? We could ask ourselves the question as to why is it that the civilizations won out in this philosophical debate. I think one explanation to this is that after 2011, the Russian Federation was scared to death that they will be another country where a so-called Arab Spring that took place in the Middle East will come to them. That democratization, as such as a process, will take over their own country as well. The protests that took place after the election in 2011, which they believe, some people believe that was rigged, the Russians think this was the West doing. It was us who did. Who fomented and fired and fueled up these protests in Russia itself. And all through this time, through the Waldorf Forum or any kind of forum where President Putin was giving a speech, he stated that we as the West did not take Russia as an equal partner in terms of security, but also in other measures as well. So I talked about the three schools, and I think that now it's important that I also discuss why and how this matters to us. What are the implications of this for the United States today? So the last great American dynasty, and this is another Taylor Swift song if you're not familiar with this. Russia thinks that done with that, right? So we're going to go ahead and change this. U.S. hegemony must go. Let's have Russia and China together redesign the world order according to their liking, and this U.S. hegemony is not representative. It's not giving us the full picture because the rise of China, the rise of Russia, well, the latter is of course questionable because we've all seen on the battlefield as to how the Russian performance was indeed looking in Ukraine. We've seen the tanks lined up. My students at the time told me, Dr. Rada, we could have just taken them on in minutes. So the Russian military might was perhaps not as strong, but I do think that despite the fact Russia is able to wreak a lot of havoc with very minimal effort. And I think that we should keep that in mind, that the balance of power that Russia and China are trying to change is problematic for us, for the United States. Let me show you this map. Prior to 2014, the Ukrainian people were fine conducting business and politics with either side of the spectrum. Why not practice a so-called multi-vector political system if you can trade with the West, with Russia? And indeed, that's what the Ukrainians did for a very long time, and successfully. The problems came in 2014 when at the second Maidan revolution, President Putin made an offer to President Yanukovych, President of Ukraine at the time, an offer that he couldn't refuse. It was a rather lucrative offer that if he does not sign the European Union Association Agreement, something that Ukraine has expected, the Ukrainian people have expected that he will sign, he will give him about $93 million in cash if he is not signing with Europe. And of course, Yanukovych did not sign the agreement. And this is where all the problems started in Ukraine. And we know how that looked like going forward. So here on this map you see NATO and the European Union. And the Russian version of these organizations is the Collective Security Treaty Organization and the Eurasian Economic Union. Both of them are sort of created in a way to mirror the Eurasian, the European Union on the long run. The second aspect as to how this matters to us is NATO expansion. You hear an enormous amount about this, and in fact, we have looked at with my colleagues at negotiations before the war started in Ukraine in 2022. I have talked to folks who were involved in the negotiation, and one of the biggest problems that Russia had a problem with was NATO expansion. They were still going by the script that indeed we had promised them hardcore that NATO will not expand. Now there's nothing written on this. No written agreements exist as to what will happen with NATO expansion. But an article based on new archival evidence states that actually verbally we did promise the Russians that NATO will not expand. And I think until the point where we speak of the Baltic states, they've always been in a different situation when we compare them to Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, that region, or Central Asia. The Baltic states always have their parallel ways of thinking, and they never fully recognized their annexation by the Soviet Union. But once there were talks about including Georgia and also Ukraine into NATO, that was a red line from Russia. And then finally, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the colored revolutions. And this is colored revolution, the slipper revolution in Belarus in 2020, COVID style at the time. What do I mean by colored revolutions? After about 2000, the civil societies in the East European countries, former Soviet republics, many of them were not happy with the pace of how the democratization process was going, how combating corruption was going. After the Soviet collapse, they were expecting a much faster pace of democratization and economic involvement and connection. In 2003, the Rose Revolution in Eastern Europe, in Georgia, took place. This is Michael Saakashvili, who comes in with a rose into parliament, and this started out the Rose Revolution in Georgia. Georgia was actually rather successful at combating corruption. But what ways, that's a different story. We see the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan, Orange Revolution, Maidan Revolution. Ukraine experienced two of these. And then finally the Slippery Revolution in Belarus. We talked about Clausewitz, some of you mentioned Clausewitz. The Russian understanding of war has evolved over time as well. Oscar Johnson's book highlights this extremely well. For the Russians, kinetic war as such has been less important than the non-military means of war, such as economic statecraft, information war, political war, and so on. Anything short of conventional war is a type of warfare that has been much more important for them over time. And actually, Johnson goes to say that actually the color revolutions are a form of warfare, which we are conducting, which the West has been conducting for quite some time. It is an information warfare that we, the West, have been doing for many, many years against the Russians. This is how they understand us. So actually, since 2014, Russia argues that they have been at war with the West. I will show you a couple of time periods quickly because running out of time, but in terms of how they have become to embrace this mindset that these revolutions are a form of war, similar to an economic statecraft or information warfare. So, during the time of 2003 and 2008, this is the time way before the Georgian War of 2008. This is a time when the majority of these colored revolutions are taking place in various countries around the fringes, on the fringes of the Russian Federation. The Russians were very quick to point out the double standards that the European Union itself has been practicing, according to them. The European Union has very strong laws and rules about minority protection. The Roma have a very wide representation, human rights, and so on. But the Russians pointed out that actually, how about the Serbs in Kosovo? How about the Russians in Latvia? We don't see the same representation. We don't see the same heavy push of them being included into society as others. So they took a problem with that. The Western behavior is selective, it's instrumental. But at this time, it wasn't the West's fault that these colored revolutions were taking place. We were there, the NGOs were operating in Ukraine and so on, and other countries, but it was not, at the time, it wasn't as problematic for the Russians. However, between 2009 and 2012, that is the time period when President Medvedev is in power, and a lot of the thinking is loosened. He's perceived to be a little bit more liberal than President Putin is. After 2011, these Russian elections that were alleged to be fraudulent elections, the Russians argued that actually it is the Western governments that are responsible for revolutions. This is us who have created this, and you see very similar rhetoric in 2014, not then in 2022, which just culminates in a vicious attack. A couple of small pictures for you. I want to highlight here that the Orange Revolution in Ukraine was actually a peaceful revolution. The Supreme Court wrote out another election, and the revolution was peacefully resolved. However, in 2014, things became violent. The democratic checks and balances no longer worked the way Ukraine wanted it to. So, in closing, what are the implications for this today? How Russia thinks? Why do we care? Why the Russian Federation, its elites, its civil society, its people think? It's because I think that this created a threat, an international threat around the world that exacerbated a threat that was already there from China. And the victory of the civilization school spiraled into an imperialist way of thinking, a nationalist way of thinking. And I think that it brought about a war in Ukrainian soul that has very high casualties. If you listen to some of the podcasts, the running price of a dead soldier in Russia is about $30,000. This is what you get if your son dies in battle. This money is paid out to relatives. This war has been justified on nationalist grounds, or I would like to say quasi-human rights grounds, because the Russian speakers, the Russian minority, were not threatened in Ukraine. They were given their civilization, they were given their rights to vote, to become a member of the Ukrainian community. And Russia thinks that they are waging a war not only against Ukraine. Make no mistake, they believe that they're waging this war against the entire collective West, not just the Europeans, but also us, because of our involvement. So to restate what I said earlier, the victory of this civilization's call came about because after the 1990s, the Russians didn't feel and didn't think that they became equal members of our liberal democratic community. And then, therefore, they turned elsewhere. The Westernizers and the civilizationists, this debate between them was resolved by the winning by the civilizations. Of course, statism, having a strong state, that stayed constant. So I will take a question if somebody would like to ask. I know it was very theoretical, but something different.
Thank you, Doctor. Great presentation again. The Chancellor Assistant, but spent some time studying Soviet East European politics and traveled in 1984 and 1991 to Russia. Very germane to this group is the question of before Putin got power. Well, it's going back to, I guess, Gorbachev. They had a polar bear. They had to have 10 men, all men, I think, no women. He was 12, I can't remember how big, but the decision to go and fight with the West would have had to have been perhaps a vote of 7 to 5. But now, if you could just reflect on, is Putin in complete control? And as the Secretary mentioned, does the strategic forces in Russia protect Putin and the party, or the Russian people? And I know these are kind of speculations, but I think one could argue we're more unstable now than we've been at any time with the Russians ever, since they've got this nuclear arsenal with one man who seems to be in control of everything. But, your thoughts?
That's a great question. Thank you. Thank you so much. We had very limited information even before the war started about the inner workings of the inner circle of the FSB and who is really making these decisions truly. I would like to go to Fiona Hill's assessment on this, who stated that, and this is prior to the war, is that at the time, much of the corruptive dealings that Putin's inner circle, and of course we know that the majority of those in the power of decision making are the intelligence community, very strongly. She argued that there are a lot of secrets within this community that they keep from each other, and especially the corrupt dealings that many of them are engaging in. So it's hard to tell who is really in the power of decision making. But if there's any indication as to how the war in 2022 started, I think that I will side with those folks who argue that the decision making is highly concentrated in the hand of President Putin and a very select few, I can't even count it on my hands, on one hand, because before the war started, people who went into war were not aware as to what they are doing. Major decision makers within the military community had no idea that there's going to be an engagement, that there will be a war with Ukraine. Soldiers who went with their uniform for a couple of days into Ukraine, they thought that they were going, into exercises, or they were going to Belarus to go on an exercise. So I side with those folks who believe that the decision making is highly concentrated, and hence we see those who fall out of the second or third story floor. So those who disagree with that, we know what happens to them. Not to mention Prigozhin. Do we have time one more?